Well, hello again, everyone, and welcome back to the TSCA Development 2021 live podcast recording. So now we will discuss some TSCA hot topics. And since we are recording this session as a podcast, please check us out on Spotify or wherever you enjoy your podcasts. And we do have, Chemical Watch does have new episodes every week, often covering, our biggest stories, what are the biggest regulatory and chemical management developments. So speaking of our panelists, I'm very excited to be here with Jeff Morris. So Jeff is a chemical policy consultant with Jeff Morris Solutions. And before opening his own shop, Jeff was a mainstay at the EPA for more than 25 years, and most recently served as the director of the EPA's Office of Pollution Prevention and Toxics. And rejoining us is Lynn Bergeson, managing partner at Bergeson and Campbell. So it makes me feel like I need to open my own shop and have my name up there somewhere. Lynn is certainly no stranger to many of our listeners here. She advises corporations, trade associations, and business consortia on a wide range of chemicals issues. And Daniel Rosenberg. Daniel is the director of Federal Toxics Policy, Healthy People and Thriving Communities, that program at the NRDC. And he previously served as an environmental counsel to Senator Frank Lautenberg, certainly a familiar name in the TSCA world. So we'll go ahead and jump right into things. And so for everyone here, we've certainly seen and heard about a lot of the changes in TSCA, certainly over the last few months. EPA has said it wants to evaluate chemicals as a whole rather than looking at sort of individual conditions of use. It's rethinking assumptions on workplace exposures, the assumptions around the uses of PPE, impacts to environmental justice communities, fence line communities. So I'll kind of open this up to everybody. In the end, where does this kind of new approach under the Biden administration take us? How does it really play out for risk evaluations and risk management rules or orders under new chemicals? Where is all this taking us? Lynn, I'll pick on you to start. You want to jump in?
Well, Terry, thank you. And I appreciate Chemical Watch's invitation to me, and I'm happy to participate in this. That's an excellent question. I think speaking on behalf of some of the clients that I am fortunate enough to represent, it takes us to places that are right now uncertain, and uncertainty is the nemesis of the business community. I think some of my concerns relate to both appreciating the Biden administration and Dr. Friedhoff's commitment to looking at chemical exposures holistically, which makes sense, and good arguments could be made that the law compels as much. The challenge is, how does one express that in a way that provides the regulated community sufficient opportunities to both participate in that problem solving and understand the consequences of it in a way that enables us to have some degree of business certainty, particularly in the new chemical review program that I know, Jeff, you will probably be addressing to a greater extent. So how one quantifies chemical exposures as a whole, what is the methodological approach? What does it mean in real terms for purposes of ongoing EPA reviews of new chemicals and ongoing EPA reviews of existing chemicals? The lack of certainty, the lack of predictability, and the lack of established protocol is what gives rise to a sense of uncertainty right now. Ultimately, it may well make for a better, more holistic approach to risk evaluation and risk mitigation. But getting to that point from where we're at now is what invites probably much of the uncertainty and concern right now from my perch.
And Jeff, we'll kind of direct that same question to you, and maybe you can even talk about sort of how this uncertainty might play out as we go from just your past experience, administration to administration, where policies might shift. But yeah, where are we headed with all this in your view?
Yeah, Terry, in all the administrations that I've worked with, without exception, they've all recognized that there's a balance between the chemicals that we need as a society and the environmental and health protections that society demands. But they just see the balance as being in a different place. And so we're seeing a different look at the balance here. I think there'll be some changes for sure in particularly the existing chemicals area in terms of what a risk evaluation looks like in terms of its scope. And perfectly, I think, legitimate and defensible to look not only at all the conditions of use such as TSCA, but really scientifically, from a risk cut perspective, you can see looking at other uses in terms of understanding total chemical exposure. But in the end, risk management has to address particular conditions of use. And so I think that as environmental protections and health protections are implemented, that things won't necessarily look quite as different as how we all envisioned TSCA to operate when the Lautenberg Act came into being 5 years ago now.
Yeah, and so Daniel, with you, kind of with the view from NRDC and trying to empower the federal government, state governments to have that authority to really, have strong authority to regulate chemicals and protect the health of the environment. What do all these walk us through the changes for from your view, from the NGO perspective?
Well, I think thank you, first of all, Terry and Chemical Watch, for inviting me. I really appreciate it. I agree with a lot of what Lynn and Jeff had to say. I think the elephant in the room that's sort of been in the room all day for this great conference is that the past 4 years of TSCA implementation under the Trump EPA was a total debacle. They completely recklessly and unnecessarily drove the entire TSCA program into a ditch so that the first basically 4 years of implementation of TSCA were wasted. And it has created a lot of the uncertainty that Lynn is talking about. That's where it comes from. And it's also why there's why it's a doubly difficult task for Dr. Friedhoff and Administrator Regan and the rest of the staff at EPA who are dealing with TSCA implementation, because they have to try and undo and work around all these absurd policies that were adopted, many of which have sort of come up in different ways here today, while still continuing to move forward and actually do the job that Congress originally intended of implementing TSCA to protect the public. I think that's where we are at this moment. I think even though people may disagree on some of the policy results or what should happen or different details, I just think that's an unavoidable truth as to what the current state of play is.
Yeah, and it's kind of similar to what we had talked about earlier in the day with Eric and Jonathan had talked about. You have a new administration, and maybe they do want to kind of change the direction, but they're in a bit of a pickle in that they also want to retain their authority to be able to decide what the EPA wants to be doing as it works forward. So, well, Daniel, we'll stick with you for a little bit, and wanted to go to how might some of the cross-cutting science issues, so changing things up a little, how might some of those issues that arose during the previous administration, how might that be important for TSCA implementation going forward? And so that could be things like the systematic review process under TSCA that the agency is now looking to revise, the now defunct science transparency or the science censoring science rule, as some have called it. How is that going to sort of play out here?
Yeah, I think one of the many areas where the implementation of TSCA was undermined and sort of chemical assessment generally was undermined at the agency was in some of the science policies that were imposed or pursued both in the Toxics Office and more broadly at EPA, including those two that you referenced. So systematic review is a good example. That was so that's something that's required in the law for EPA to use a systematic review. And instead of, picking up and using or adapting one of the existing peer-reviewed, widely accepted approaches, instead, the office decided to create their own systematic review, the TSCA systematic review. I call it the Nancy Beck systematic review. And that was a deeply flawed vehicle that led to a lot of problems with the risk evaluations. I think it made them take longer and much more vulnerable to consistent criticism from the science advisory panel that reviewed all the risk evaluations, and then ultimately by the National Academy of Sciences, which reviewed that method and pretty much rejected it entirely. So now that's another example where now, instead of just having a systematic review method in place, that's some retooling that absolutely has to be done quite urgently. And I think there, the best step for EPA and Dr. Friedhoff is to pivot and do what they should have done originally and adopt, the National Toxicology Program's OHAT method or the navigation guide from University of California, San Francisco, some other method that can do the job, and just sort of move past the, basically break free from the, ideological policies that were imposed by industry folks who were running the agency the past 4 years.
I might, take some, Dan, I respect your views enormously, but I wanted to circle back to, at least expressing my view that there's not been total carnage of TSCA amendments over the past 4 years, and that the process is iterative. I know there have been many, many disagreements with respect to how EPA should go about conducting risk evaluations, how EPA should go about evaluating new chemicals. I'm not prepared to accept that the work that has been done by EPA since the beginning of the prior administration to the present is a total waste. There's been a lot of good information provided to EPA. Industry has worked hard on risk evaluations. We can respectfully disagree that how the data are interpreted and according to what science framework is used, it may not be to everyone's liking, but I just can't accept that the last 4 years has been a total waste of time. And Jeff, I'm sure you probably harbor similar views. So I just wanted to respectfully disagree that we only have carnage now and that it is up to Dr. Friedhoff to raise us all from the ashes.
Right. And Lynn, thanks for that. And as Dr. Friedhoff said herself this morning, the good scientific work that the career staff has produced heretofore, I share her view that it will stand and is of very high quality. I'd also like to say that, as we look going forward, TSCA 5, looking in the next 4 or 5 years down the road, that broadly, I'm optimistic that 3 things are going to happen. One, TSCA implementation is going to become more predictable. The more individual actions that are taken, the more stakeholders across the spectrum will understand what's going to be coming in terms of how the agency applies the statutory requirements. And with that predictability will come increased transparency as everyone understands how things are being done. And then finally, I think that the implementation will be more efficient, and that will help everyone in terms of making decisions more quickly and protections put in place more effectively. So I think there's lots of room for optimism that this process will continue to evolve. As Daniel said, there'll be changes made, but that we are at a point at TSCA 5 where there's a lot of good work, I think, that has been done that can be built upon to continue to move the program forward.
And good news is always nice to hear as well. So how might TSCA risk management measures for workers mesh with OSHA regulations and personal exposure limits, or PELs? Any thoughts on sort of this area? Yeah, go for it, Lynn.
I'm not certain I understand what mesh means, because as I think we all appreciate, EPA has vastly more experience in assessing worker exposures, particularly derivative of new chemicals in the workplace, than does the team at OSHA. And EPA works with OSHA and NIOSH to harmonize and determine what measures are most appropriate to control those exposures. But this goes back to the early days of Lautenberg. There's no doubt in my mind that EPA takes the lead, as it were, in reviewing chemical exposures for purposes of new chemicals in the workplace, to the extent that existing exposures in the workplace from existing chemicals, that's all similarly done in the context of a Section 6 risk evaluation. And I think OSHA would similarly defer to EPA's more recent, more robust worker exposure scenarios for purposes of controlling those exposures. So the mesh part is a difficult question, because if there are PELs and STELs in the workplace or other exposure standards, they will be trumped by better data provided by EPA in the context of a risk evaluation. So the existing OSHA infrastructure continues apace, but to the extent risk evaluations or new chemical reviews elicit better data and more specific risk control measures or PPE measures or other workplace standards, those will prevail, and they will prevail presumably on a parallel path, but EPA exposures being, the taking the lead, as it were, over any existing OSHA standard.
And I guess I would agree as well that this is an area where we can expect also in continued evolution in the TSCA program in terms of more precise and more sophisticated risk management, including with PPE. The relationships with both OSHA on the regulatory side and NIOSH in terms of the equipment efficacy those relationships are established, and they will continue to be leveraged and built upon as implementation requires close looks at what type of risk management is needed. And I think the PPE discussion we're having now is going to be extremely valuable in advancing that, so that we're not taking a blunt instrument in terms of whether it be a respirator or gloves to a particular exposure scenario, but rather being very focused, practical, and yet protective in applying PPE provisions.
I agree with a lot of what Lynn and Jeff just said. I think one of the ways that things will evolve, and this is kind of going back to my earlier harsh view of the previous administration, I'm hopeful that in the next 4 years, in conferring with OSHA and NIOSH and drawing on their expertise, the EPA will actually listen to what OSHA and NIOSH have to say rather than ignoring it, which is how they handled NIOSH's and OSHA's objections to their assumption of 100% PPE use. That is one example of how time was wasted and the process was misused. Because they weren't even taking the existing expertise that they were offered seriously. I think there's been a desire for some to suggest that EPA should defer to OSHA, or this should all get moved over to OSHA. Or, that TSCA has a subsidiary role, a secondary role to OSHA, and that's just not the case. And I don't think that's where it's going at all. And lastly, I would just note that the hierarchy of controls includes elimination and substitution as kind of the top tiers. And so the PPE of gloves and respirators, that's obviously a very important ongoing conversation and will remain relevant. But I'm hoping that the new administration will view the hierarchy of controls with the full picture of what that means.
Yeah, and Dr. Friedhoff this morning, I think, did say that, hey, if they look at, the risks of certain chemical applications and they decide, OSHA's current requirements are not sufficiently protective, then TSCA does require them to, reduce below an unreasonable risk. So yeah, we certainly could see EPA stepping in a bigger capacity. Another issue that kind of the new administration, the Biden administration, has really made sort of a central focal point is environmental justice. Both President Biden and Administrator Regan have said that environmental justice should be central to the agency's work. So Jeff, maybe we'll start with you on this. How can TSCA support those priorities like environmental justice and maybe some of the other priorities that the Biden administration has put forward?
Right. I mean, I'm very excited about the idea of TSCA taking what I believe is its rightful place at the fence line. I think that there is great potential to leverage the provisions of TSCA, particularly as was discussed this morning, the provision for potentially exposed or susceptible subpopulations there. And one element of that I do think that I do hope is explored, and perhaps the Scientific Advisory Committee on Chemicals can help with this, is looking at how non-chemical factors, what are sometimes called social and economic stressors, impact the susceptibility to disease from associated with chemical exposure. I think that this is just an essential element in putting TSCA within the EJ context within communities. And I think that this is an area that TSCA needs to take its rightful place in. And the other area, I think, where administration priorities can be assisted by TSCA is in the new chemicals program. Now, the materials and technologies that are in place today that help with issues like climate change and renewable energy would not exist were it not for new chemicals that came into commerce years or even decades ago. And there's the potential, I believe, for the new chemicals program to play a role in advancing new chemistries that help further advance the administration's priorities in areas like climate change.
Yeah, and Lynn, maybe give you a chance to jump in on just the environmental justice question. How do you really see that playing out through TSCA and kind of living up to sort of the goals of the administration?
Well, it is crystal clear that this administration has made environmental justice not just a critical point of TSCA implementation, but an agency-wide, government-wide priority, which is long overdue. I wrote an article a while back on EJ and TSCA because it seems TSCA structurally has a uniquely important role in optimizing all that I think Congress intended it to be with regard to vulnerable subpopulations, sensitive subpopulations, and being mindful of that when establishing regulatory reviews and undertaking risk evaluations for existing chemicals and new chemicals. I also think this administration is to be complemented by having some outstanding superstars as part of the administration. Professor Marianne Engelman-Lado, who is now part of the EPA Office of General Counsel and former professor of law at Vermont Law School, has just an astonishing array of publications and thoughts and very innovative approaches to achieving environmental justice, however that term is defined. What is fascinating to me is how do you take a concept and an aspiration that is so timely, so overdue, and so essential to making the world a better place, and systematically infuse that in a law and its regulatory policies interpretations. It's going to require a lot of work and much more discussion than we have given it in earnest to date. But I'm, as Jeff said, very enthusiastic and very hopeful that environmental justice will be more than an expression and will be a component of chemical evaluations in a way that helps achieve Congress's goal and helps achieve this administration's goal of making it a priority.
Yeah, and Daniel, yeah, throwing it your way, Daniel.
Yeah, no, I really agree with what both Jeff and Lynn said. It's a very it's a reason to be optimistic about what can be accomplished and what should be accomplished under TSCA. Adopting an environmental justice as a priority is it fits hand in glove with I think TSCA as Congress intended it, and it will, if implemented, it will result in implementation of TSCA as if people mattered, and that's really what the environmental justice movement is supposed to be about, and really the environmental movement should have been about all along. So it's a potentially really great thing for the country, to be honest.
Yeah, and so speaking of sort of TSCA's authority and what it should do with various substances and even issues of the day. So we do now have a question. I'm surprised it took this long, but we have a question on PFAS. So what role can or should TSCA play in addressing concerns related to PFAS? A lot of it has been about kind of discharges into water and drinking water levels. But what role can TSCA play, and should there be a class-based approach to kind of looking at these substances? Daniel, we'll kick it off with you.
Sure. It's funny. I was gonna if I'd given a longer answer in response to what Jeff said on the environmental justice question, I was going to raise PFAS. So while the positive side of, let's say, of the new chemicals program is that can it approve new chemicals that lead to technological innovations and hopefully, ways of addressing climate change, it can also lead, if not implemented properly, to the approval of chemicals or whole classes of chemicals that are a huge problem for health in the environment, that are incredibly persistent, mobile in the environment, and toxic. And that is toxic, and that is definitely the case with PFAS. And it undermines everybody, really, because the PFAS are everywhere. But it also has very serious environmental justice implications, because now you've got all this AFFF foam that DOD has that they can't figure out how to get rid of, and they want to burn it. And where are they burning it? They want to burn it in incinerators, and those incinerators are situated in environmental justice communities. So it's a very wide-reaching thing. PFAS should definitely be regulated as a class. EPA should not be approving any more PFAS. And they should, they're going to do this 8A rule to gather information. I think it's an embarrassment, frankly, that it took Congress intervening through the National Defense Authorization Act to require that 8A rule. That could have happened, without Congress setting a deadline and making them do it. There are other things that EPA could do with SNRs and ways of ratcheting down on the use of existing PFAS. And I think all of that needs to happen as quickly as possible.
Yeah, and Lynn, so Daniel had mentioned that the 8D rule coming regarding PFAS and having to look back and report, really on potentially, hundreds or thousands of chemicals that might have been used. What impact do you see that on PFAS?
Oh, most assuredly. I mean, TSCA is, again, a uniquely versatile rule that enables EPA to obtain additional information through Section 8 rules, to issue test rules under Section 4, to exercise its discretion under TSCA Section 5 in reviewing new chemicals. EPA is in the process of making TSCA in ways that it use all of those authorities, and it should use all of those authorities. I'm not sure I agree with the proposition that Daniel just noted that, did you say PFAS should be regulated as a class, Daniel, or PFOS?
No, the whole class of PFAS chemicals. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess, I'm not a fan of that view, because I'm not of the view, as I think many folks are, that because it is a PFAS, it is necessarily bad or, unfit for purpose. EPA has a very rigorous new chemical review policy, and that policy should be deployed, as it always is, consistently, fairly, and rigorously. But as a class, I think it would be very difficult to regulate all PFASs simply by virtue of their membership in a class, however that is defined. EPA has sufficient tools to assess PFASs that are presented as new chemicals. EPA is now going back and asking certain LVE recipients to rescind or withdraw LVEs for some PFASs at their discretion and with their consent. So the agency has a lot of different ways of getting at what is legitimately defined as a problem. But all PFASs are bad. TSCA has sufficient tools to address chemical risks as they arise. And EPA should and is deploying all of its authority under 4, 5, 6, and 8 of TSCA, and will continue to do so, I'm sure, for the foreseeable future.
And if I could just add, one of the provisions of the Lautenberg Act that I've come to increasingly appreciate are the scientific standards provisions. Based on what we know now, across the PFAS universe, hazard and exposure potential vary significantly across that broad universe. So I wouldn't want to compromise the scientific standards of TSCA in using that statute to implement actions that may be not supported by the data at this point in time. I am very supportive of the agency's continued look to identify what segments of that PFAS universe need particular focus, scrutiny, action, and continue that work. And if it's done deliberately and with the continued, I think, balanced approach that the staff at EPA have taken, we'll get there. And I totally understand the concern, particularly when it gets into a community's water. But I think that I would just be very concerned, I think, as Lynn has taken a broad brush approach to PFAS as a label for a very broad and diverse range of chemicals.
I just don't see how you can characterize the current situation as anything. I mean, everybody refers to it as a crisis. I don't see how you can refer to what EPA has done to date under the new chemicals program, under the existing program regarding PFAS as a success. TSCA also allows EPA to regulate chemicals or treat chemicals as a class. Congress originally in 1976, you guys both know this, of course, banned the entire class of PCBs. They didn't say we have to go one congener at a time. We have to look at each one. They're all so different. They understood that as a class, that was a problematic class of chemicals, and they banned it. Now, there's been not enough done on PCBs even, and those are still in the environment. You have PFAS in everybody or virtually everybody. They're in our food. They're in the sludge that's going on the crops. They're actually finding the short chain PFAS, which have come through the new chemicals program relatively recently, in rainfall in the Great Lakes. That report is just out. I mean, the tools are not there for EPA to actually address PFAS with this one-by-one approach. That it won't work for PFAS, it won't work for phthalates, and it won't work for some of the flame retardants. You need to be, EPA needs to be more aggressive and more health protective in addressing some of these issues, and definitely PFAS.
Right, Daniel. And just to clarify, I mean, I'm also a big supporter of the provision in TSCA that allows the agency to look at categories of chemicals, for sure. I just want to make sure that the construction of any categories within the PFAS universe is consistent with the scientific standards provisions of the law. And I think if it is, then we can get at a place where we get to, I think, the sentiments that you're expressing, but in a way that will, over time, stand up and be defensible. And also we'll use the agency's resources, everybody's resources, most effectively to address the problems where they need to be addressed. That's all.
I mean, clearly PFAS is an ongoing conversation. The one other thing I'll just quickly say is it's ridiculous that EPA has so much trouble. I'm not blaming EPA for this exactly. Even identifying which PFAS are in the environment and where they are, because they don't have the analytical methods to even identify where those PFAS are. Industry is sitting on analytical standards, analytical methods for identifying more than the 29 PFAS that EPA can currently identify. And TSCA should absolutely be used to obtain that information. And frankly, I think, as with FIFRA, EPA should be obtaining reference standards and methods for any new chemical that comes through the PMN program, so that we don't have a repeat of this problem with some other number or hundreds of chemicals going forward that we don't even know about yet.
Yeah, and so I'll stop the discussion there. Just certainly we could talk more and more on PFAS and yes, and shameless plug, Chemical Watch will be having an entire conference dedicated to PFAS regulation at the end of June. So please feel free to go to chemicalwatch.com and learn more. So it seems to be a pattern all day today, I've gone a little bit over time. But I do want to give each of you kind of just a chance to maybe share your final thoughts, and I'll kind of throw out a question if you want to address that, great, or if you had just wanted a final thought on something else, feel free to kind of speak your mind on that. But the kind of generalized question is just, what's really surprised you most about how the changes to TSCA have played out over the last 5 years? Daniel, how about we start with you and we'll kind of go around from there.
Sorry, I just had to unmute. Probably what I'm going to say won't surprise many people. I think what surprised me most was just how extreme the political appointees that took over the Toxics Office and EPA were, and how ultimately inept they were, even in imposing their disastrous policies. We've talked about so many of them today. The refusal to consider environmental exposures, the assumption about PPE, excluding whole sources of exposure from the risk evaluations. Imposing changes on the career scientists in the risk evaluations when they didn't like the results. All kinds of things like that were just so extreme. And ultimately, I think they were hurtful to industry. I mean, certainly they were hurtful to the public, but they were also hurtful to industry because now, as Lynn said, there's much less certainty about how the program is going to be run. And, I think having so many career chemical industry people running EPA and then, like I said, driving the program into a ditch has, undermined industry's credibility a little bit. And I think that, their voice is going to be somewhat diminished as far as legitimacy and relevance, given how they just acted for the past 4 years. And I'm hoping that that going forward, there will be a real cultural change at the agency and in the Toxics Office in particular, and that EPA can become a leader on these issues of environmental justice and moving to safer chemicals and not just a sort of industry-friendly laggard.
And thanks very much, Daniel. And Jeff, we'll go next to you. Any sort of final thoughts that you wanted to leave?
Yeah, Terry, a year ago at TSCA I talked about what I thought was a need for a shared commitment among all TSCA stakeholders to help with implementation. And I meant that in two ways. One was individual stakeholders identifying areas where they could take leadership to take some of the burden that the agency has been shouldering almost by itself. Areas like gathering and providing data, environmental justice. But it also meant finding ways, committing to finding places where stakeholders across the spectrum could work together. And I think we see in the non-animal testing area where that can happen. And I'm surprised that 5 years in, we're not, at least, I believe, at a point where we've embraced that notion of shared commitment actively in terms of evidence that we're doing it. But I'm optimistic because, one, I think the demands of the statute will require it, as we've heard throughout the day today. And then two, I also gather from the tenor of the discussion here that the people who are involved in TSCA don't want to take okay, now it's my turn, it's my administration now, I'm going to do this, but rather a recognition that no, we're all in this together, and we need to find ways to move the statute forward in ways that are going to serve the people of this country, which is what we all want to do. So those are my final thoughts.
Yeah, and definitely. And Lynn, so any big surprises for you over the last 5 years, or final thoughts you wanna leave us with?
Very quickly, because I know we're running out of time, but I continue to be optimistic. My biggest, I guess, surprise was how kind of polarized the stakeholder community has become, which I deeply regret, because I think we are better when we speak with one another, and as Jeff indicated, commit to doing what Congress expects under the law and follow the science. I think if we continue to do that and work in a transparent way and speak with one another, so we're not always depending upon EPA to come up with paradigms and proposals and ways of getting the job done, and to have a more participatory approach to sharing the burden. Jeff and I have had many conversations about this, and industry can and should step up and join in a process that is more open and transparent. I think we would get to a better place, and it would certainly be less divisive than it is now.
Yeah, and well, yes, follow the science. We definitely heard that from EPA quite a bit over the recent weeks and months. So, but unfortunately, that is all the time that we have. But yeah, thank you very much to Lynn, to Jeff, Daniel. This has been great. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And thank you guys. And for everybody kind of listening from home, from work, on your phones, I hope this has been insightful and of great value to you as well. We do have several other virtual events lined up over the coming weeks and months. I had mentioned the PFAS event. So we do have the PFAS Updates virtual conference that will be on the 23rd of June. And then towards the end of July, the 20th and 21st of July, we will have our first 2-day Latin America Regulatory Summit. So please keep an eye out for those events, and look on the website, Chemical Watch website, if those might be of interest to you. Look forward to welcoming you back to future events, and take care, stay safe out there, and yeah, goodbye for now.